want to give a shout out to the dev tools that you guys built for it from another engineer that used to be on the team, Tyler. We actually used that library to build our website. So that's one of the cool things about having a design system. So going back to that, constraints breed creativity. A lot of creativity came out of that. It was really fun to graft the idea of dev tools into just like a website for geeks about our podcast.
That was a really fun project. Tyler and I, also ex-Intuit employee, literally had, Storybook up and running, and we used the Design System CLI, another, Intuit open source thing. And it's funny because, you're trying to replicate the DevTools UI. So you have Chrome or Firefox DevTools open, and then Storybook right next to that, trying to copy and paste like styles over and get themes right. It's a fun project.
Yeah, and the really interesting thing about those DevTools is not only are they like faithful implementations of browser DevTools, but they're also super accessible, and they have all the same testing that we have for normal design system components. I don't know what a normal design system is or what makes DevTools different. It's just a design system for developer tools, but it meets all the same implementation. And it also served as like a great how-to for using DSCLI, because like we open sourced the design system CLI stuff, but obviously we didn't open source our entire design system. So it was sort of like, here's a bunch of stuff that you could use to create a design system. Imagine how. And there's no like reference implementation. And so DevTools sort of serves as the reference implementation for, hey, this is how you would actually go use the other tools that we have to go make a design system.
This is more than just a hello world. Yeah. This is actually legitimate. Like, we use this too. Yeah. So
maybe we can pause for a second and explain the two things that we've talked about here. So there's this DevTools design system, which Adam, that you were mentioning, is actually like a faithful representation or re-implementation of what you would see in Firefox or Chrome in the developer tools panel if you're editing a site, which is super cool. And then Design System CLI, when y'all want to explain more like what that does and what its responsibilities are.
Yeah, so I'll start with the DevTools design system. So working on Player, we needed a way to kind of, similar to React DevTools or Redux or any of the other like Chrome extensions that you would use to introspect what's happening. We also have one for Player. So, if you're in TurboTax or, on our end-to-end environment, you can load up this Chrome extension and actually kind of see what's happening in the inner workings of data and debug things. And in doing that, we needed a bunch of React components to paint the page and didn't really find anything out there that existed. So we made a design system and tried to make it as close to the normal browser, components. So there's a nav bar, there's any of the object inspector stuff, which Tyler did an awesome job with and learned a whole bunch about JavaScript types that I had no idea existed. So we wanted, like David was saying, it's an accessible DevTools design system, and we use it internally to make both Chrome extensions and a bunch of other things. And that is built off of Design System CLI, which is this whole suite of tools for building out a design system. So as we were building out some of the stuff within Intuit, we took what we knew to be best practices. So for building, shipping both a CommonJS and ESM build, making everything tree shakeable, making sure that we have testing. Also wrote a test runner to run against using WebDriver IO and a bunch of other things. Kind of this whole suite of things to be able to quickly scaffold, test, deploy an entire design system. And that's called Design System CLI.
Yeah, my baby. I worked on that quite a bit. How many design systems are we up to now at Intuit? When we refer to design systems built with Design System CLI, I always like to put air quotes around design system because we fling that term around very loosely. What Design System CLI really produces is just a development environment for components. Whether you actually made a design system, that's not up to you. When I left Intuit, I think we were sitting around like 45.
I think we crossed 50. I don't have it up, but I think pretty sure we have at this point.
Yeah, I think we've got over 400 components now, sitting in something approaching 50 or over 50 different libraries. It's different teams creating components to sort of solve their unique customer problem. They're built on the same, because they're all using this tooling, they're sort of interchangeable. You know that the quality of one is going to be relatively similar to the quality of the other. And then they like I said, one of the pushes that we're making is to sort of extract and then reinfuse all of the design tokens so that if a team in Mint builds something for iOS, the QuickBooks mobile iOS team could use that same component and know that it already supports their theme. So yeah, Adam mentioned earlier that we sort of fell backwards into creating a design system from this semantic player representation of things. We also fell backwards into creating all the tooling that we have for creating design systems because it was like, hey, we've got a bunch of scripts to do, like all of design system CLI started as scripts inside the consumer group's design system package. And then it was like, oh, we should use some of these things in the QuickBooks design system or the Mint design system package. Let's just go ahead and extract these. And then Andrew was like, I'm going to go open source it. Okay, sounds good. Let's go do it.
That's usually the process. I mean, even Auto, like the other big open source project, all started as literally a Python script I wrote as an intern. And that evolved into a slightly more complicated JavaScript file. And then I think that's when we started experimenting with TypeScript. Is that right?
Yeah, and then a wildly more complicated TypeScript file.
Yeah, it was like, hey, what if we try out TypeScript? And then eventually one day it's just like, hey, Andrew, you want to open source this? Okay. And that's kind of the path that we started going down. I mean, yeah, Design System CLI was a bunch of JavaScript files in a build script in one of our repos. Just like, hey, some other team needs this. What if we kind of package this? And we had a new open source project.
That's definitely one of the things that the player team is good about. The two people that we have here today are excellent at drawing boxes. I always make the joke that architects draw boxes, but David draws good boxes, and Adam really taught me like the boundaries between modules and how to make like reusable code. And definitely all stems from the player team. Go ahead, Justin.
I'd like to ask a little bit about open source. So I previously worked at a big media company, and open source was hard. Open source was something that you needed a lot of approval. There's legal concerns. It was not necessarily an easy thing to go through. At the same time, though, we were consuming open source like crazy, right? Everything is built on open source. Now I'm at a company who has had open source as a part of its ethos, and it's different. We do everything open source by default, but it has its own trade-offs. So I'm curious, Intuit being a financial company has, I'm sure, a lot of security concerns and a lot of things that you have to take very seriously when considering open sourcing something. So talk a little bit about your culture and how you think about open source and what your process is around those decisions.
I've been at Intuit for a little over 6 years now, and I can say that when we started, or when I started there, like the culture around producing open source software was a little different than it is today. We obviously would consume a lot of open source software. Intuit's primarily a Java shop on the back end, so tons of Apache and Spring and all the great stuff that comes out of the Java open source community. And obviously on the front end, we are heavy consumers of React. And the process of open sourcing stuff was almost undefined because we just didn't. One of the earlier things was like, there's Karate, which is one of our test runners. It's used by a ton of people, but that's like a back end sort of thing. We had open sourced some stuff for iOS, but not a ton and not a repeatable process for it. That's really changed over the last couple of years. A few years ago, we got a new CTO. She came from Docker, where they obviously are open source by default, kind of like Artsy. And it's become easier over time. We still have all the legal concerns. You go through a vetting process for any open source project. You take your GitHub repository and you start prepping it. You groom it for what you want to actually ship. And then you get it ready. You present it. You have to get sign-offs from your manager, from an architect, from legal. You got to make sure that it fits with what we want to do, the image that we want to present externally, because obviously we don't want to be bad open source citizens and just say like, here's a thing that we use, and then we stop using it, and now it just dies, but it's still sitting there under github.com/Intuit, and you're just like, well, Intuit sucks at open source because they ship things, but then don't maintain them. So yeah, we do go through a process. It's heavier probably than it would be if you were a smaller company that wasn't dealing with tax data or with small business data, but I think it's gotten remarkably better since the time that I've been here. So
I think it's still something that we're growing and learning as we keep going. The player team being one that, has open sourced a whole bunch of projects. It's interesting having, we have a new manager that came on, talking about how part of our normal life cycle is managing open source stuff, managing, GitHub issues and requests that come in, and support channels for projects that we wrote that we now have to be good citizens about and help people out, onboard to. So there is some, maintenance involved with open source. It's not just ship the code once and you're done. And I think that's something that may surprise people when they, first initially come on.
And it's the investment is hard to maintain, and it's definitely something that you got to carve out of your quarterly plans or your yearly plans. And you're saying like, hey, I'm going to devote X%. Well, that's X% that's coming out of your total overall development budget, right? And so it can be hard, especially when you're looking for something where it's like, oh man, if we could just get one more thing in. Oh, but there's this juicy, 5 to 10% of time that we could cut over here. And it's like, no. We've gained more from that 5 to 10% of investment than we will ever get from cutting that. So don't touch it. That's like one of the best return on investment that you can get, because, you think about design system CLI in and of itself, it's a set of scripts that utilize other things. We're sitting on top of an amazing software ecosystem. We've got Storybook, we've got Babel, we've got Webpack, we've got all these different things that are sitting underneath there that, let alone like the actual design system components, React, Jest. We've got all these tools that we're using. We would never be able to build all those ourselves. And so being able to consume those and then contribute back to that ecosystem, that pays dividends. Like I said, I think our CTO, she's one of the things that she did when she got that job is she's like, look, this is how we were able to succeed at Docker. We did a ton of open source. We worked in public. We got more contributions. We contributed back. It was a thriving ecosystem. And having that sort of air cover from the CTO level lets me as an architect in a business unit say like, hey, I know that we want to shave some time here and like cut that investment and go reallocate that time. But if I can point to the CTO and say, well, she said to, then really no dev manager can tell me no, right?
Yeah, and I love that. Like, it's seeing that change, and I've been into it for just about 5 years now, I think. It's been really cool to see that whole change. Andrew and I gave a talk at Dev Week with one of the main Storybook guys, and we would never have gotten there without both Auto being released and contributing back to Storybook and that relationship and building that. That's been awesome just to kind of watch unfold and change a lot.
Yeah, it's really cool to see what a quality developer tool can do. I spent countless hours developing Auto and never would have expected the type of adoption we saw into it, but like the amount of dev hours saved because of a release automation tool is just like staggering when you add it all up.
And not just even in JavaScript projects. Like, we use it for iOS projects that are releasing CocoaPods. We use it for Android projects that are releasing AARs. It's all over the place. I personally use it on a couple of back-end projects that I maintain, just small Java libraries that are just dumping jars into Nexus. And it's kind of amazing that it's like, oh, this was just a Python script or eventually a more complicated TypeScript project, and now we're just using it for releases all over the place, even outside of the web ecosystem.
Built on giants. I like to brag that we use the same plugin system that Webpack uses.
Yeah, and that, Tappable in and of itself is, I think, one of my favorite projects out there. Like, almost any pluggable or semi-complicated app that I build or library, it's just a matter of time before we pull in Tappable.
I liked it so much that we created a Kotlin version of it using some time from one of our hackathon weeks. One of our Android engineers and I sat down and we just rewrote Tappable in Kotlin and used Arrow Meta, which is a compiler plugin framework for the Kotlin compiler, because we were like, hey, we like this thing so much and we want to use it in one of our backend services, but the backend service is written in Java, so let's just sneak some Kotlin in here and we'll use a cool Kotlin compiler. plugin, and so we love Tappable so much that we rewrote it for a different framework altogether.
Let's bring these two conversations we just had together. We had one about the player and we had one about open source. Where's the future of the player? Is it in open source?
That's what we're aiming for. The argument I always make is we're supporting so many business units and so many different customers within Intuit that kind of the landscape and the problem area is wide enough that we have to be agnostic to almost everything about where we're running. And at that point, we're basically an open source project. So why not actually make it all open source? And that's what we were building towards. We talked about kind of I think one of the last miles that we have is some of the developer tooling around content authoring. And that's one of the spaces where I want to come out with something, but I also know that the open source community can outdo anything I put out in the first weekend. So I am super excited to see where it's taken and what cool things can come out of it, and just everything that can be built on top of the player.
Yeah, people used to ask me about open sourcing the player, and we would not have wanted to open source the original version. It was not as robust as you'd like it to be, and way more tied to TurboTax than it should have been. So Adam's done just a killer amount of work, leading the team through sort of a large transformation around Tappable that makes everything much more pluggable, much more clean, and that's allowed us to sort of cut the TurboTax pieces out and move them into a TurboTax plugin for the player, which has enabled us to sort of have a very clean implementation of the core and then the basic web, iOS, and Android players. And then that is what we are planning on open sourcing. So we just got to, like Adam said, get to that sort of last mile of making the rest of the tooling around it good. Because I know from personal experience that if you show someone something cool and then it's like, oh, neat, how do I use this? And you immediately open up a JSON file, they're like, oh. And so I don't want to do that.
Not
right?
as cool as I wanted it to be.
Like, we want to make sure that it's cool.
Yeah, it's definitely a mountain of work that you guys have overcome. You had a whole design system baked in. It's this completely different monster.